This weekend, tens of thousands are gathering to mark the 50th anniversary of the March for Jobs and Freedom. They come to commemorate the march and continue pushing for the completion of the vision of that march, first eloquently articulated that day by the Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. His I Have a Dream speech expressed his hope for a time when America would become truly colorblind and when justice for all was a reality and no longer just the ideal. His words from that day are the first ones that come to mind for many when they hear his name. For me, however, there are different words that come to mind when I hear his name. They come from a writing of his from 3 months earlier from the Birmingham jail. He had been arrested along with other protesters for violating a local ordinance against such protests. The words that I recall don't describe his vision of a colorblind America where every child can play with each other regardless of race. Instead, his words shared the reality of his time when he had to tell his 6-year-old daughter that she couldn't attend a newly opened amusement park because it wasn't opened to colored people. In it, he describes watching his friends and relatives arrested, beaten, even killed, merely for not being of the majority race. These words are part of what we now know as the letter from Birmingham jail, contained in his book published the next year, Why We Can't Wait. It is his response to the Birmingham clergymen who at the time of his protests stated that they were untimely and unwise and should have been delayed until a more opportune time. These fellow clergymen, many of them white, but many of them also of African American descent, agreed that the cause was just. And while supporting in general the civil rights cause, believed he was using unjust and unwise actions by breaking these laws. Because even though the laws were unjust, they stated, they believed that his advocating the breaking of even these laws would lead to the complete breakdown of all law and order. So instead, they admonished him to give the Birmingham administration, which had been newly elected after Bull Connor, to give them time to have an effect and to change these laws. From the first time that I read Dr. King's rejoinder to his fellow clergy, it has struck with me. He wrote, "For years now I have heard the word wait. Wait has almost always meant never. More and more I feel that the people of ill and of ill will have used time much more effectively than have the people of goodwill." And he concludes with the words that still resonate whenever I hear his name. We must use time creatively in the knowledge that the time is always ripe to do right. And in some ways, I hear that sentiment as the heart of today's gospel passage. When is the right time to do right? And when, if ever, is there a wrong time? Is there ever a time when the better thing is to delay? In this passage, it's too easy to reduce this to Jesus, the good guy, and the synagogue leader as the bad guy, who is more concerned with arbitrary, legalistic interpretations of the law than with this poor woman before him. When we do so, that allows us to demonize the leader as heartless as well as reassure ourselves that we would never act in that way. Yet there's a deeper concern to the ruler's objections than that Jesus is just breaking some rule. Sabbath is one of the defining elements of the Jewish identity and also who God is to them and the rest of the world. And so as a synagogue leader, his position makes him responsible for not only understanding, but interpreting the rules around the Sabbath in order to help protect that identity. He is charged with responsibility of helping the people live out to be who they are called to be. And this woman is not in any imminent danger. She isn't going to die if she is not healed. She doesn't even ask Jesus to be healed. So the leader isn't objecting to her healing per se. His sole objection is that it should have been delayed a day for a more opportune, appropriate time. And it should have been done so not just because it's a rule, but because it's for the good of the Sabbath, the good of the people. The time will come for her healing. He's not denying that, and he's hoping for that someday too. She and all others, though, who would seek healing this day, they just need to wait until then. His concern here is that Jesus is trampling the Sabbath by pursuing personal interests. And isn't that what we heard warned against in the reading we heard from Isaiah? The leader doesn't necessarily lack compassion for this woman. He just wants to make sure that the people hold fast to the rules for the good of all people. As one scholar put it, she's borne her affliction for 18 years. It's not unreasonable to imagine she could wait another day. Can you hear the echo of those clergy's objections to king's actions and this leader's objections to this healing? For the clergy, it wasn't that they said Dr. King and his fellow protesters shouldn't be there because they agreed with the laws as they were. They disagreed profoundly in many cases. However, they also had a concern for what they saw as the greater good, for respect of the law. They feared that chaos would erupt if people began to believe that the law should be purposely flouted. Wouldn't it be better if Dr. King and his supporters just waited? Not never have this happen, but just waited until people had the change of heart, as they inevitably would. Waited until progress allowed these changes to be made. After all, it had only been a century since the abolishment of slavery. Think how far things had come. Time would bring the changes they sought. God would remove that yoke of injustice from them, yes, but when the time was right. It's easy, I think, to look back at the synagogue leader in the first century or these clergy in the 1960s in Birmingham and say how wrong they were. That Sabbath moment was exactly the right moment for Jesus to free that woman. That spring of 1963 was exactly the right time to challenge those laws. It's easier, I think, to look and see where others have said wait, when other people who have sought a justice or a freedom or a dignity afforded to most of us are told that, yes, you deserve it, but not now. We need to take care of a few things first to get ready for when you can have that right, that dignity as God's child. It's harder, if not impossible, to see it when it's ourselves doing it, when we are not the ones suffering the injustice, when we are not the ones who are seeing the world askewed because we are being told that we need to be bent over for a little bit longer, as the crippled woman was. There's no shortage of the list of places where I could share that I see where this yoke of oppression needs to be lifted today. Ironically, as I wrote the sermon, I started to give you the list after I said that. But the reality is, I don't need to. For you have your own lists, I'm sure. You are loving and compassionate people. You see many of the injustices in the world. And some of these, we would agree on how that yoke should be lifted. On others, we may have different ideas. But what can be hard for all of us to see, I think, is a fear or a concern of losing our own personal status or power is the reason for these differences. I know I often need to have others point out to me when I am holding fast to something by saying wait instead of now. When I am holding fast to something and saying, yes, I do believe that that would be the right thing, but not now, not quite yet. My friends needed to point this out to me, that I was doing just that as I argued for civil unions as a necessary intermediate step before equal marriage rights for all. For just as Dr. King did with his fellow clergy in Birmingham, Jesus does with this leader in the synagogue, I sometimes need to have called to my own attention that I am holding fast to something that is really denying or hurting another child of God more than the others who will be hurt or inconvenienced by abolishing it and letting it go. And then there are those times when the forces of the law or injustice comes to bear upon a loved one of ours, and our eyes are open to the injustice. Only when we can see it reflected in the eyes of the other who we love do we recognize the pain of being told, you must wait until the time is right. Wait until everybody catches up. Wait until God deems the time is right. Sometimes it's only seeing that reflection in the eyes of someone we love to see that while we are arguing that something is unjust or wrong, we are still holding fast to it just a little while longer because of the discomfort that it causes for us to give it up. 50 years ago, at the March for Jobs and Freedom, hundreds of thousands gathered to sing, pray, and speak for an end to discrimination. They came to declare that the time to wait for justice for all was over. The time was now. In a less quoted part of his speech from that day, Dr. King declares, "We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind the Americans of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to taking the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all God's children." We are still tempted at times to say wait when it comes to ending discrimination in any of its forms or bringing halts to an injustice. My prayer today is that the urgency of the spirit of now, as expressed by Dr. King and shown by Jesus that day to the woman who was bent over, that compassion takes root in us and grows, so that we do realize and understand that the time is always ripe to do right. For that is what God calls for all of us to do. Amen. On this 50th anniversary of the March for Jobs and Freedom, I think most of us would be willing to admit that we have come quite a ways, but we still have quite a ways to go. Not only to how we deal with our differences in races, but how we deal with all the differences that we have as human beings from each other. But there are still people who will still call us, who will still remind us that when the time comes and we are faced with that decision of, is now the right time for this child, for these children of God to live fully as one of God's beloved, that the time is always ripe for the right thing. One of the songs of the civil rights movement is "We Shall Overcome." And as it talks about overcoming, it doesn't lay out a vision of overcoming as we so often do in human ways, where one overcomes another and makes another oppressed, but of a time when we will live in peace. So I leave you with a reminder that we will live in peace. We will live in peace. We will live in peace one day. Oh, deep in my soul, I do believe we shall live as one someday. Let's go forth and make that day today.